name is Tasneem Essop, and this is the final episode of Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. Over the course of this series, we've explored the idea of the just transition in South Africa through conversations about energy, land, governance, affordability, participation, and political power. At its most basic level, the just transition is often framed as a way to ensure that workers and communities tied to the old carbon-intensive economy are not left behind as the country moves toward renewable energy and a lower carbon future. But what the researchers, activists, and communities featured throughout this series have pointed out is that South Africa's transition does not begin on equal ground. Long before the transition fully takes shape, millions of people are already living with unequal access to energy, water, land, infrastructure, and economic opportunity. Communities closest to power stations and mining activity often still struggle with access to electricity themselves. Land remains shaped by histories of dispossession and exclusion. Public participation frequently takes place without people feeling genuinely heard. And the institutions meant to guide the transition are themselves navigating deep historical and structural contradictions. What emerges from these conversations is that the challenge is not simply how South Africa moves away from coal. The deeper question is whether the country can use this moment to confront forms of injustice that already exist within the system itself. Because if those inequalities remain unresolved, they risk simply being reproduced inside a new green economy. At the same time, this series has also shown that there are alternatives already being imagined and fought for. Ideas around developmental access, affordability, local participation, co-production, and democratic ownership suggest that the transition could become more than a technical shift in energy production. It could become an opportunity to rethink what justice, inclusion, and access should actually mean in South Africa. Throughout this episode, we'll hear excerpts from conversations with PARI researchers whose work has shaped the series and helped unpack the realities, contradictions, and possibilities of the just transition in South Africa. We begin with economist and researcher Dr. Tracy Ledger.
So it's a bit of a generalization, but more of a global north definition of a just energy transition, which is that the justice applies to people who are adversely impacted by decarbonization of the economy. So those are people who work in the coal industry, people who work in coal-fired power stations, people who work in the fossil fuel industry. So it's primarily an employment issue. And then also, obviously, you have communities and local economies that are very tied to coal. So then the just energy transition is about how do you make sure that sort of the losers in the transition are taken care of. We don't think in a developing country context like South Africa that is a sufficiently wide definition. So we found it useful to think about the energy transition as comprising a journey and a destination, and that we need justice in both. And if we look at the definition of a just energy transition that talks about justice for people who work in the coal sector, for example, that's part of the energy transition journey. And we think that that is necessary, but not sufficient. Because what that definition does is that it in no way problematizes the existing energy system except for its carbon emissions. Whereas there are many equities in the system, mostly as we've been talking about, in access to electricity and access to energy. So we think it's as important to think about what does justice and equity look like in the destination that we're moving to. So how do we have not just equity in the transition, but how do we transition to a system that is more equitable?
What Tracy Ledger points to here is something that would become central throughout the series, that the injustices associated with South Africa's energy system did not begin with the transition itself. Questions of access, inequality, and exclusion already exist inside the present system. And nowhere is that more visible than in the question of land, a resource already shaped by long histories of dispossession, unequal ownership, and competing claims. Next, we hear from PARI researcher Dr. Gaino Paradza, who leads PARI's land governance program.
Land is a limited resource. So everybody who's already having claims on the land in some way, whether as a landowner or as a tenant, already has some claim to the land or squatting. So the transition brings extra pressure on the land. And as people try to adjust, whether they are investing in new infrastructure like the wind farms, or it's too hot and people have to move from where they are, it affects their land tenure, or maybe the value of, say, a forest reserve has now changed because it's been earmarked for a wind farm. The value of that land changes, and the terms on which that change in land use is done can affect the tenure of maybe people who go there to hunt, to fetch firewood or forestry. So a just transition is about making sure, as we respond to the different pressures on the land, that some people, especially the poor and already marginalized, do not carry more of the negative impacts than those who have been previously privileged. If you look historically, it's like the apartheid era dispossessions have continued, but with different names. So around 2008 to 2010, the Land Matrix, organization was leading, capturing the data. It was called land grabbing for fossil fuels, for food by Middle East companies, for jet fuel. And now it's being called green grabs, and mostly talking about extension of the conservation area. What they don't say is that that is being done at the extent of people who have been historically disadvantaged. And every single time the narrative they are placed is the ones who are responsible for undermining the land, when actually they are so few in number and they have not recovered from the colonial era dispossession. It's just that now it's called green grabs.
What emerges here is that the transition does not arrive in an empty space. It enters a society already marked by deep structural inequality, where land, resources, and economic power remain unevenly distributed. And these tensions do not only exist at the level of communities, they also shape the institutions of the state itself, particularly in a country whose economy and political history have been so deeply tied to mining, extraction, and energy production. We now turn to PARI researcher Dr. Thokozani Chilenga Butao.
So I think the minerals energy complex is seen as part of the backbone of the South African economy. And as we've been discussing, we can see why. Coal mining, but mining in general, is part of our country's legacy, history, GDP, etc. But on the other hand, just as we discussed conflicts of interest, at the community level, at the business level, and all the way up, there were always conflicts of interest within the minerals energy complex, right? Where we knew that state-owned entities or Eskom were built mainly for businesses and running an economy, but not necessarily for keeping the lights on for all of us. And now that's the purpose of energy, right? Is to say it's not just about the economy, but it's also about who has access to energy, who has access to electricity, and what that means in a state such as ours, where inclusion, people's rights, responsibilities of the state matter more than just building or creating energy supply for business. And so I'm not saying that the minerals energy complex is no longer important, but I'm saying it's becoming more complex, and I'm sure in a lot of these communities, even in mining areas and mining towns, you find that no matter how close they are to the supply, they themselves still would have problems with energy and access to energy and access to electricity. I think that this came in quite late in the report in terms of the role of the minerals energy complex, but it was important to note that given the history of the MEC in our economy, in the political economy, but in our society in general, this could be one of the points that is preventing the DMRE from participating in the just energy transition in a different way. That maybe it's trying to maintain a minerals energy complex that no longer fits the context that we are in. And then you have to deal with that internal conflict first before trying to deal with why is it not stepping up to the just energy transition. Mining towns were historically established because mining companies went there to break ground and then urbanized or built up that area for profit and for their convenience. And now what we're seeing is a continuation of that legacy in, one form or another, where a state-owned entity or even, the DMRE and other players, government departments and institutions are not thinking about what they should be doing to develop those areas beyond people's dependence on energy and mineral resources. And now that the just energy transition is bringing up all these conflicts at different levels, be it community, SMMEs, larger provinces, and the state in general, we're left asking, what is the role of the state in these communities? Similar to legacy mining towns, where effectively they had to hand over not only resources, but in some cases political leadership, because they had been leading those towns, right? And that is a dangerous situation where, as Wasim and Masatsi are saying, the state appears to be absent. It's a dangerous situation because there's mistrust within the community, there's lack of accountability, but also there is no plan to ensure that however this transition happens, if it happens, when it happens, then people are protected. And that's what really matters in the energy transition, is that are people going to be protected? Their livelihoods, their families. We don't want a different legacy playing out of forced removals, which we know is happening at some scale, right? And so we have to make sure that in the just energy transition, with all these conflicts that are happening at different levels, we do hold the DMRE and different institutions accountable. One participant actually in our research said, look, the just transition and people's livelihoods and mine workers and other industries dependent on the energy industry is not a job for the DMRE. It is a job for the state, whatever that means, whether it's Department of Labor, Department of Small Business and Enterprise, National Treasury. They need to have a holistic development plan that is going to assist these communities with the just energy transition. And when they said that, I thought it was quite callous to say, well, it's not the DMRE's job to figure this stuff out. But the more that we do field work, whether it's on the ground or with the DMRE, we're starting to realize that it's true. There has to be some sort of transition plan, development plan. Essentially, that's missing. Whether you want to mine right to the center of the earth or whether you want to, transition energy, you still need a sustainable plan. And that's where people then look to the DMRE to say, what is your role in this as one of the key players?
Throughout the series, another theme kept surfacing. Even where participation processes exist, communities often experience them as distant, procedural, and disconnected from the realities of their lives. People may be invited into meetings, consultations, and public forums, but that does not necessarily mean they are shaping the decisions being made. Here again is Tracy Ledger.
Lots and lots of people in communities said to us, we haven't been consulted. And then organizations like the PCC would be quite frustrated with our analysis and say, but we've been in that community so many times. How can people say they haven't been consulted? And what we realized is that when people said we haven't been consulted, they didn't always mean we weren't in a meeting. Sometimes they weren't in a meeting, but a lot of times they were. But that's not what they meant. What they meant when they said we haven't been consulted is they mean we haven't been heard. We haven't had the reality of our lives turned into the plan. So we were in the meeting and we saw your plan, but your plan has got nothing to do with our lives. So when we started to think about it from that perspective, then we realized that the point is not having every single person in the room during the public participation process. It's about expanding what we think of as evidence to inform the policy. So this is one of the things that we realized, is that the policies around the JET were being made very much around official data sets about numbers of formal businesses in the coal sector, number of formal employees in the coal sector, and a very limited other sort of data. But that there were all sorts of other things that were important to people that were not being captured because they were not in these official data sets. So, for example, what was not being captured? Well, there were all of the people who were contract workers in Eskom power stations who consider themselves employees of Eskom, but in the official data, they're not employees of Eskom. There are all the people who work in the informal sector tied to the coal sector, whether that's women selling food on the side of the road or people renting out back rooms that were not taken into account. There was all of the social infrastructure in communities that's dependent on the coal sector, like schools, aftercare centers, ECD centers. And then there were all of the services that are actually provided by the coal sector and Eskom to communities, from community playing fields, community centers, domestic violence centers, support for communities. And all of these things were really important to communities and were going to have an incredible impact on their lives when they were lost, but they were not visible to policymakers. So what we realized is that an important part of facilitating co-production was, in fact, to broaden this base of information that policymakers are using to make policies around the just transition, as opposed to just having everybody in the room after the fact.
What these conversations ultimately point toward is the need to think about the transition differently, not simply as a technological shift from one form of energy to another, but as a broader transformation of the systems that shape everyday life, from governance and participation to livelihoods, ownership, and access itself. PARI researcher Mahlatsi Rampedi reflects on this broader understanding of transition.
In practice, it means that the transition for the people is not just moving away from coal. It's not just about bringing in technologies, but it's a whole movement of the whole system itself. It's about creating new opportunities for work, for training, for education, something that will sort of like influence the development of like sustainable livelihoods, for example. Essentially, it's something that would include things like gender equality, local ownership, environmental health, prioritized within the situation. So it's about rethinking the entire system of governance and economics so that it works for the people, not just like the few interested parties. It should be a systemic change that improves the lives of people in a much deeper, more lasting way, not just changing the source of energy.
And finally, we return to Tracy Ledger, whose work on affordability and developmental access has been central to so many of the themes explored throughout the series.
So when we think about access, we have to think beyond just physical access. Often when we talk about access to electricity or access to water, we think about electrification, connecting households to the grid or connecting households to a formal water system. But that's not enough to actually be able to use enough of the services to be able to live a dignified life and to be able to engage in productive activity. So I think it's very important to remember that when we look at foundational documents like the Reconstruction and Development Program and the National Development Plan, that access to resources like water and electricity were meant to achieve two goals. First of all, they were meant to facilitate a basic standard of living, but then also, very importantly, that people have got access to enough services to be able to engage in productive activities, whether that's water for growing food at home or whether it's electricity for a small business. So it doesn't help if you're just connected to a service. You have to be able to actually use enough of the service to achieve those goals. And all of the services have to be paid for. We don't have a system where people can access endless amounts of services for free. So affordability is actually the most important barrier towards people being able to access enough services. The most important item that is sacrificed in households to pay, especially for electricity, is food. And the reason for that is because food expenditure is one of the few items that households actually have control over. They don't have control over how much rent they have to pay. They don't have control over how much taxi fare they have to pay. They don't have control over most of the expenses, but they can adjust their food budgets. So what is happening, and the research has shown that in multiple occasions, is that households are reducing the amount of money that they allocate to food in order to pay for electricity, and particularly because of the rise of prepaid electricity meters. It means that people can't defer their electricity purchases. Now, that is very important, the impact of reducing expenditure on food. South Africa, for a middle-income country, actually has incredibly high food insecurity, child malnutrition, and food insecurity outcomes. So when households reduce food expenditure, they do two things. First of all, they purchase less food, so they're not eating enough calories. But almost more importantly, what they do is they cut out the more expensive, high-value protein items. So 28% of South African children under the age of 5 are classified as stunted. And the main reason for that is because of insufficient protein in their diets. So we're supposedly improving people's lives by giving them access to services, but because they can't afford to pay for them, they're taking money from their food budgets, and the end result is a deterioration in our development outcomes. And there's been some research that was done. People were asking, why have child malnutrition statistics not really improved as social grants have increased? And one of the main reasons for that is because of the competing claims on those social grants apart from food, and electricity is a big one of those. The differentiation between survival level of access and developmental level of access is based on this understanding that access to services is meant to facilitate a particular outcome. It's not just a tick the box, people are connected to the grid, or it shouldn't be. That's what it's turned out to be in many cases. But the reason why we want everyone to have access to services is so that they can improve their standard of living and so that they can engage in productive activity, especially using electricity. So if we want access to services to deliver that developmental benefit, then we need to think about the amount of services that people can actually access. And there's a certain minimum level of services that are required in order for people to be able to sustainably improve their lives. And if we want to realize the developmental benefits of access to services, we have to make sure that when we talk about universal access to services, that we're talking about everybody having access to a certain minimum amount of services.
Across this series, we've heard that justice cannot be separated from access. Access to electricity, access to water, access to land, access to opportunity, and access to decision-making itself. What the Just Transition reveals is not only the challenge of moving away from coal, but the deeper inequalities that already exist within South African society. Because for many people, exclusion did not begin with decarbonization. It was already part of daily life. The danger is that if these inequalities are not confronted directly, they may simply be carried over into a new green economy under a different name. But this moment also creates possibility. A renewed focus on energy, infrastructure, and development gives South Africa an opportunity to ask deeper questions about what justice should look like. The researchers, activists, and communities featured throughout the series have shown that alternatives are possible. Systems built around affordability, participation, dignity, and shared benefit rather than exclusion and extraction. And perhaps that is the central lesson of this series, that a just transition is not only about how energy is produced, it is about changing who the system works for. You've been listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. Thank you for listening.